The wind cut through my sweaters like knives that morning, a bitter and unrelenting force that seemed to mock me almost personally, as if it too had been invited into the cruel little spectacle unfolding at the edge of the frosted parking lot. I stood alone at the crumbling bus stop, shivering so violently that my teeth clattered together in a kind of musicless rhythm, my fingers raw and pink from the cold, despite the 2 pairs of gloves I had managed to scrounge from the lost and found bin at school the day before. Across the lot, framed in the brittle winter sunlight like a family portrait that had long ago decided I didn't belong in the frame, my father and his new family strolled leisurely toward their gleaming black SUV, their matching designer jackets shining like armor against the bleakness of the day. I watched, silent and hollow, as my stepmother, Meredith, a woman whose smiles were sharpened to razors and whose laughter often felt like a punishment, caught sight of me standing there, layered in sweaters 2 sizes too big, scarves too thin to be of any use, and boots whose soles had long since given up the fight against the cold. She paused for the briefest moment, just long enough to ensure I had seen her, before leaning into my father's side with an exaggerated theatricality, laughing as if the idea of warmth and love were jokes only they were allowed to understand. And then, because cruelty was never accidental in Meredith's world, she cupped her mouth with her manicured hand and called out across the lot in a voice thick with false concern and bright with mockery, "Try not to freeze out there, sweetheart." I didn't respond. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. Instead, I let the words hit me square in the chest and settle there, heavy and wet and permanent, another stone placed carefully in the growing wall I was building around my heart. I watched them climb into the heated leather seats of the car, laughing, turning up the radio to some upbeat pop song that I could hear even from where I stood, and without looking back once, they drove away, tires crunching over the ice as if running me over metaphorically wasn't quite enough. And that was the moment right there, frozen into my bones more deeply than the chill ever could reach, that I made a promise to myself so fierce and so absolute that it vibrated through every cell in my body. I would never forget this. I would never forgive this. Not ever. Not for them. Not for me. Not even for God. It wasn't always like this. There were days, blurry now like an old photograph left too long in the sun, when my father would lift me onto his shoulders so I could pick apples from the highest branches, when he would tuck me into bed and trace little shapes on my back until I fell asleep, safe in the certainty that I was loved. But life has a way of shifting under your feet when you least expect it, doesn't it? One day you're the center of someone's universe, and the next, you're an inconvenience they forget to pack when they move on to their next, shinier life. I was 11 when Meredith entered the picture, a tornado disguised as a woman, sweeping through our quiet, imperfect home with her sharp smiles and unspoken demands for perfection, her surgically enhanced beauty masking the rotting core of her soul. Within a year, she was pregnant with twins, and I, Lily, the leftover daughter from a marriage that had collapsed under the weight of resentment and unspoken accusations, became little more than a reminder of a life my father wanted to pretend had never existed. The slow erosion of my place in his life wasn't dramatic. It didn't come in screaming matches or broken plates or custody battles fought in courtrooms. No, it was worse than that. It was death by 1,000 small betrayals, the forgotten birthdays, the missed school plays, the way he stopped calling me honey and started calling me kid in a tone that didn't quite hide the inconvenience he felt each time he said it. At first, I tried harder. I got straight A's, thinking maybe he'd notice if I brought home report cards covered in gold stars and glowing praise. I memorized his coffee order and woke up early to brew it just the way he liked, even though the smell made me nauseous. I laughed at his jokes even when they weren't funny, sat through endless football games pretending to care, and swallowed the bitter taste of Meredith's backhanded compliments like communion wafers. But no matter what I did, it was never enough. Because I wasn't them. I wasn't shiny and new. I was a relic from a life he had outgrown, a mistake he didn't know how to erase without looking like a monster, so he settled for making me feel invisible instead. The bus arrived 15 minutes late, rumbling and wheezing like an old man at the end of a marathon, and when the doors groaned open, the driver barely glanced at me as I climbed aboard, dripping melted snow onto the cracked rubber floor. I took my usual seat near the back, huddled against the window where I could pretend the frost patterns were mountains or rivers or something beautiful, anything other than what my life had become. I pulled my knees up to my chest, feeling the chill seep into my bones, and closed my eyes. I imagined a different life, a life where my mother hadn't left, where my father hadn't traded me in for a newer model, where love wasn't conditional on how well you fit into someone else's carefully curated image. In that life, I had a coat that wrapped me in warmth instead of clinging to me like a shroud. In that life, there was a home where someone would notice if I didn't come back one night. In that life, I mattered. But that life wasn't mine. And if I wanted anything better than this, I was going to have to carve it out of the frozen earth myself, with bleeding hands and teeth bared against the cold. Because no one was going to save me. Not my father. Not the stepmother who smirked at my suffering. Not the half-siblings who would grow up believing that I was nothing more than a sad story their parents never bothered to finish telling. Only me. When I finally stumbled into school, my hair damp with melted snow and my sweaters hanging heavy on my frame, nobody noticed. Nobody ever did. I wasn't one of the pretty girls with their sleek hair and brand-name boots, the ones who shrieked and laughed in tight clusters by the lockers, their teeth too white and their futures already paved with Ivy League dreams. I was Lily, the quiet girl with the patched-up backpack and the 1,000-yard stare, the girl you didn't invite to birthday parties because you were pretty sure she wouldn't know how to have fun even if she showed up. I made it to homeroom just as the bell rang, sliding into my seat and pulling out my notebook with mechanical efficiency. I could feel the stares, the whispers, the subtle tightening of shoulders whenever I was near, but I didn't care anymore. They couldn't hurt me any more than I was already broken. And broken things, I was starting to realize, had a kind of dangerous beauty all their own. I wasn't soft anymore. I wasn't sweet. I was sharp and jagged and ice-cold, and someday they would all learn just how much damage a frozen heart could do. The night they came to my door was the coldest of the year, a night so brutal that the stars themselves seemed to shiver against the blackened sky, the wind howling like a living thing clawing at the edges of my tiny apartment. Inside, the warmth from my single battered radiator barely kept the frost from creeping along the window panes, and I sat at my scarred kitchen table hunched over textbooks, my fingers stained with highlighter ink, my mind a laser focus of determination and exhaustion. It had taken me months of relentless, backbreaking effort to get here, months of juggling minimum wage jobs that paid just enough to scrape by. Months of swallowing pride and sleeping on a threadbare mattress in an apartment so small it felt more like a closet than a home. Months of living on black coffee, instant noodles, and raw ambition because no one, not one soul, was going to come save me. The scholarships had come like lifelines tossed to a drowning girl, won through sheer force of will, essays written at 2 a.m, letters of recommendation begged from teachers who barely remembered my name. Interviews survived by clenching every trembling muscle until the fear had nowhere to go but inward. At university, I discovered something shocking and intoxicating. Without the weight of my family's indifference suffocating me at every turn, I could breathe, I could thrive, I could shine in ways I had never even dared to dream. Professors began to know my name. Fellow students who once would have looked through me like smoke now turned to me for help, for guidance, for friendship that didn't feel like a petty transaction waiting to be balanced. There were moments, brief and brilliant as shooting stars, when I could almost forget the hollow ache inside me, the emptiness carved out by years of being the afterthought in someone else's love story. But the past has a way of finding you, no matter how far you run or how high you build your walls. That night, it found me in the form of a desperate, frantic pounding at my door, a noise so foreign and violent against the quiet sanctuary I had built for myself that it made my heart lurch violently in my chest. For a moment, I simply stared at the door, unsure whether I had imagined it, whether perhaps the building itself was just groaning under the weight of the ice and the years. But then came the sound again, louder, faster, almost panicked, the sound of people who believed they were entitled to be let in. Slowly, mechanically, I pushed back my chair and stood, my legs stiff from hours of sitting still, my heart thudding heavily against my ribs as I crossed the short distance to the door. I hesitated with my hand on the knob, every instinct in me screaming that opening this door would mean inviting something back into my life that I had fought too hard to leave behind. But curiosity is a treacherous thing, and so is the bitter satisfaction of seeing the people who once discarded you now forced to come crawling. I opened the door, and there they stood. My father, his face hollowed and ghost-pale under the bruised glow of the street lamp, holding my youngest half-sister in his arms like a shield against the cold. My stepmother, Meredith, her mascara smeared down her cheeks in dark rivers, clutching a soaked designer handbag as if it might somehow buy them salvation. The twins, huddled together in oversized jackets that could not hide the terror etched into their young faces. For a long, suspended moment, none of us spoke. The icy wind howled between us, shoving and pulling like an impatient third party eager to force a decision. I took them in with the detachment of a surgeon studying an X-ray, recognizing the familiar shapes, but feeling no warmth in the recollection. My father, once tall and imposing, seemed to have shrunk into himself, his shoulders hunched, his eyes bloodshot and rimmed with a pleading I had never thought I'd see directed at me. Meredith, always so composed, so superior, now looked as brittle as glass, her lips trembling, her once pristine nails cracked and dirty. Without speaking, my father took a hesitant half-step forward, as if the very act of moving toward me might break whatever fragile permission he hoped to earn. "Our house," he began, his voice raw and cracking like old wood under pressure. It caught fire. He swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder as if the memory itself might be chasing him up the stairs. "Faulty wiring," he said, almost too softly to hear over the wind. "The whole place, it's gone, Lily. We lost everything." There was something almost poetic, almost biblical, in the way he said it, the mighty fallen, the proud brought low. For a moment, I simply stood there, gripping the edge of the door so tightly that the metal bit into my palms, feeling the churning war inside me break open and roar to life. Compassion, that stubborn, treacherous instinct, rose up first, whispering that they were cold, that they were frightened, that children innocent of their parents' sins should not have to suffer. But rage was never far behind, was it? It surged up like a tidal wave, drowning the soft voice of pity, reminding me in vivid, brutal detail of every slight, every sneer, every empty place at school concerts and cold nights at bus stops. Every time Meredith had looked through me like a smudge on an otherwise perfect painting. I could almost hear her voice again, dripping with that venomous sweetness as she smirked from the heated leather seat of their car, calling out, "Try not to freeze, sweetheart." How poetic it would be to return those words now. How fitting. But my father was still speaking, stumbling over his own desperation like a man drowning in his own guilt. "We didn't know where else to go," he said, his voice ragged and broken in a way I had never imagined it could be. He gestured helplessly behind him, to the shivering children, to Meredith who was now openly weeping, her face buried in her hands. "We're family, Lily," he said, and there it was, the ancient weapon pulled from its velvet sheath, polished and gleaming and thrust forward like a demand. Family. The word hung between us like a noose. I closed my eyes briefly, inhaling the freezing air until it burned in my lungs, until it scoured away the instinct to either scream or weep. When I opened my eyes again, they were dry and clear and colder than the wind itself. "Family," I repeated, my voice a low, controlled hum that barely masked the riot of emotions beneath. Meredith looked up then, hope flickering to life in her bloodshot eyes, mistaking my repetition for acquiescence. But I wasn't finished. "Where was family?" I said slowly, deliberately, each word a stone hurled at the ground between us, When you left me shivering at a bus stop while you drove away laughing. My father flinched visibly, but said nothing. Where was family? I continued, my voice rising slightly, gaining force like a gathering storm, when I sat alone year after year, birthday after birthday, waiting for a father who couldn't be bothered to remember I existed? Meredith opened her mouth, perhaps to protest, perhaps to excuse, but I held up a hand and she fell silent, the same way a dog obeys a master who has finally shown it the whip. And where, I said, my voice trembling now with the force of the memories crashing against me, was family when you let her? I jerked my chin toward Meredith. Mock me, humiliate me, erase me, while you stood by and said nothing? The silence after that was absolute. The wind died down for a moment, as if even nature itself wanted to hear how this would end. I could see it in his face, the shame, the regret, the dawning horror of a man who realizes too late that the bridges he burned were the only ones that could have saved him. And yet, even knowing all of that, even standing there with all the power finally in my hands, my heart wrenched painfully at the sight of the children, their small faces pinched with cold and fear, clutching each other as if the world itself might shatter under their feet. They didn't deserve this. No child ever does. I stood there, trapped in the impossible space between justice and mercy, between the girl who had been left behind and the woman who could finally choose whether to open the door or slam it forever. It would be so easy to let them freeze. So easy to turn my back, as they had so often turned theirs. But if I did that, then wouldn't I become exactly what they had always believed me to be? Hard, bitter, broken. Slowly, with a heavy heart and hands that trembled slightly, I stepped aside. The doorway yawned open, warm light spilling into the darkness. I said nothing. I didn't need to. They filed in silently, heads bowed, the twins first, then my father carrying the youngest, Meredith trailing last, her pride stripped away like dead leaves in a storm. As I shut the door behind them, locking the cold firmly outside, a strange, terrible clarity settled over me. I hadn't forgiven them. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But mercy, I realized, isn't something you give because the other person deserves it. Mercy is something you give because you refuse to let them turn you into something you're not. For a long moment after they crossed the threshold, the only sounds inside my tiny apartment were the low moan of the wind pressing futilely against the windows and the soft, tentative footsteps of the people who had once walked away from me without a second glance. I closed the door slowly, the old hinges creaking in protest as if the very walls themselves understood the gravity of what had just been done, the profound reversal of power, the moment where the abandoned daughter became the reluctant savior. They stood there awkwardly, dripping melted snow onto the cracked linoleum, their breaths coming in quick, visible puffs that mingled and disappeared into the dim air of the room like guilty spirits trying to find an escape route. I turned toward them, my expression carefully measured, my heartbeat slowing back to its steady drumbeat, no longer the frantic hammering of fear or rage, but the calm, unyielding rhythm of someone who has already made their decision and is ready to bear the consequences. Meeting their eyes one by one, I allowed the silence to stretch until it became a living thing, until it filled every corner of the cramped space with its suffocating presence. Then, with a voice so quiet and composed that it felt like a blade sliding between ribs, I said, "It's cold outside, isn't it?" I watched the words strike like a blow, watched them ripple through the room and settle heavily on their shoulders like the very weight of the winter they had once left me to suffer alone. My father's face crumpled almost immediately, a flicker of something, shame, recognition, regret passing over his features so quickly that if I had blinked, I might have missed it. He opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but no words came, just a dry, helpless rasp, and I watched with a distant, clinical detachment as he lowered his head, unable to meet my gaze any longer. But not Meredith. No, Meredith was a creature of pride and venom, and even now, stripped of her luxuries and her smug superiority, she could not bear to stand in silence and accept the consequences of her cruelty. Her eyes, bloodshot and wild, narrowed into slits of fury as she crossed her arms tightly over her chest, her body shaking not from cold, but from the effort of containing the poison she had been drinking for so many years. "This," she snapped, her voice brittle and cracking under the strain, "this is exactly what I always warned your father about. You're selfish, you're spiteful, you always have been." I didn't flinch. I didn't move. I simply stood there, letting her words bounce off the fortress I had built inside myself, a fortress constructed brick by agonizing brick from every moment she had belittled me, from every slight and every act of calculated cruelty. I didn't need to respond. My silence was a mirror, and in it, Meredith was forced to confront the ugliest parts of herself, parts she had spent a lifetime blaming on everyone else. The tension in the room became unbearable, thick and choking like smoke, and for a moment I thought perhaps the silence would break them completely, would send them scurrying back into the night where they belonged. But then a sound pierced through the heavy stillness, a soft, hiccuping sob that shattered the fragile mask I had worn so carefully all evening. It was my youngest half-sibling, a little girl barely old enough to understand the complexities of betrayal and bitterness, her small hands clinging desperately to the tattered hem of her father's jacket, her tiny face crumpled in confusion and fear. The sound of her crying, raw and unfiltered and unbearably vulnerable, cut through every layer of armor I had wrapped around myself, reaching into the most secret places of my heart where the scars were still tender and bleeding. And in that moment, something inside me cracked, not in the way that weakness creeps in and crumbles resolve, but in the way that tectonic plates shift deep beneath the earth, creating the kind of change that is both inevitable and unstoppable. I saw myself in her, the abandoned child, the one left to weather storms she had no hand in creating, the one forced to make sense of a world that had always been stacked against her. And with that recognition came a flood of clarity so pure and so overwhelming that I staggered slightly, reaching out instinctively for the back of a chair to steady myself against the onslaught of emotion. I would not become the kind of person who met pain with more pain, who answered cruelty with the same cold indifference that had nearly destroyed me once already. I would not be her. I would not be him. I would not be the sum of the wounds they had inflicted upon me. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I turned away from them, blinking hard against the burning in my eyes, and walked to the tiny closet near the door where I kept my extra blankets, my spare jackets, the little bits of comfort I had scraped together piece by piece over the months. I pulled out everything I could find, stacking them high in my arms until they wobbled dangerously, then carried them over and dropped them unceremoniously onto the battered couch that served as my makeshift living room. "You can sleep here," I said, my voice rough and uneven despite my best efforts to keep it steady. "Make do with what you have." My father murmured something, perhaps a thank you, perhaps just the sound of a man so broken he no longer knew how to form words, but I didn't look at him. I didn't trust myself to look at him just yet. Instead, I knelt down beside the little girl, who was still sniffling quietly, and helped her out of her soaked coat, rubbing her small, icy hands between mine until I could feel the beginnings of warmth returning to her tiny fingers. She stared at me with wide, uncertain eyes, and for a moment I wondered if she could somehow see the battlefield inside me, the scars and the rage and the love all tangled together into something messy and imperfect and painfully real. I tucked a blanket around her gently, smoothing her hair back from her forehead the way I remembered my own mother doing once, in a time so distant it might as well have been a dream. And as I did, something inside me shifted again, not breaking this time, but building, reforging itself into something harder, stronger, and infinitely more terrifying than simple anger. Forgiveness was not something they could demand from me, not something they could beg or bargain for. Forgiveness was mine to give, or to withhold. And tonight, I chose neither. Tonight, I chose survival. I stood slowly, my joints creaking in protest, and turned back toward the couch where Meredith and my father sat stiffly, awkwardly, as if they no longer knew how to exist without the trappings of wealth and power that had insulated them for so long. "You can stay tonight," I said, my voice flat and unyielding. "But tomorrow, you find another solution." They nodded, hollow and grateful and desperate, and for the first time in my life, I realized the power they had once held over me was gone, stripped away by fire and frost and the relentless march of time. They needed me now. They needed me more than I had ever needed them. They sat on my couch like ghosts, like memories that had lost their power to haunt, their bodies small and uncertain against the faded cushions and thin blankets, while the radiator clicked and groaned in the background like an old man too tired to complain anymore. For a long time, I didn't speak. I let them sit in that silence, let it wrap around them and tighten with every second they refused to look at me, because sometimes silence is not an absence but a presence, something sharp and heavy and impossible to ignore. When I finally spoke, my voice was low and calm, but beneath that surface there was steel, the kind of unbreakable strength forged only in the cruelest fires. "You have one night here," I said, each word slicing the air with surgical precision, "one night to find shelter from the storm you created." My father lifted his head slowly, his eyes glassy and hollow, his face pale in a way that had nothing to do with the winter outside and everything to do with the reckoning inside these four walls. "And tomorrow," I continued, my voice never once rising, never once faltering, "we talk about how you will treat me from this moment forward. Respect is not negotiable anymore. Not ever again." The words hung there between us, solid and immovable as a mountain, and for the first time in my life, I saw understanding flicker through my father's eyes, not the grudging, half-hearted acknowledgement he used to toss my way like a bone to a stray dog, but true, bone-deep recognition. He nodded once, slowly, deliberately, emotion so heavy with meaning it seemed to pull his whole body down with it, as if the weight of all the years, all the failures, had finally settled on his shoulders and crushed the man he used to be into something smaller, something more human. But Meredith, of course Meredith, was not built to bend. She was built to snap, and snap she did. She surged to her feet in a whirl of expensive fabric and wounded pride, her face contorted into something almost unrecognizable, something desperate and vicious and terrifying in its smallness. "This is outrageous," she hissed, her voice sharp enough to draw blood. "After everything we've been through, after everything we've lost, you dare to talk to us like this? Like we're beggars at your door." She was trembling not from cold, but from the unbearable realization that the girl she had spent years trying to crush had grown into a woman she could no longer control, could no longer diminish with a sneer or a cutting word. I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I simply stood there, a wall of unmovable stone against her fury, and watched as she realized that there would be no battle to win here, no game to play, no door left open for her manipulations to slip through. "Go, then," I said quietly, almost gently, gesturing toward the door with an open hand. "If my conditions are too much for you, you're free to leave. No one is keeping you here." For a heartbeat, she stood frozen, caught between pride and survival, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air in a world it no longer understood. And then, with a guttural sound halfway between a sob and a snarl, she grabbed her soaked handbag, threw open the door with a crash, and stormed out into the freezing night without a single glance back. The door slammed shut behind her with a finality that echoed through the tiny apartment like the closing of a tomb. For a long moment, no one moved. The only sound was the soft, hiccuping sobs of my younger half-siblings, curled together on the couch like wounded animals, their small faces blotchy with fear and confusion. I exhaled slowly, feeling the anger drain from me, leaving behind something quieter and heavier, something closer to grief. Without a word, I crossed the room and knelt beside them, gathering their trembling bodies into my arms, feeling the frantic hammering of their little hearts against my chest. I rocked them gently, murmuring nonsense words, pressing kisses to their hair, doing for them what no one had ever done for me when I was their age, and the world had first taught me how cold it could be. And as I held them, something inside me shifted again, not the brittle, rage-fueled resolve that had kept me alive all these years, but something softer, something fiercer in its own way. I realized that strength isn't just about standing tall when the storm hits. Sometimes strength is about bending down and sheltering someone else, even when no one ever sheltered you. Sometimes strength is about refusing to become the monsters who made you. And sometimes strength is about saying, "You will not define me," not with fists or screams or icy silences, but with actions so loud and so undeniable that no one can ever erase you again. I tucked the children tighter under the blankets, smoothing their hair back, wiping their tears away with the sleeve of my sweatshirt, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years: purpose. Not the desperate, hollow drive to prove myself to people who would never see me. Not the frantic scramble for scraps of love or attention or validation. But real, solid, immovable purpose, the kind that doesn't ask for permission or approval, the kind that builds a life out of ashes and dares the world to try and burn it down again. When the little ones finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, I rose to my feet, every joint aching, every muscle humming with exhaustion, but my heart steady and sure. My father was still sitting on the edge of the couch, staring blankly at the floor, his hands hanging uselessly between his knees, the portrait of a man who had finally seen the true measure of his failures laid bare. "You should get some sleep," I said, my voice softer now but no less firm. He nodded without speaking, his movements slow and mechanical, and I watched as he stretched out awkwardly on the other end of the couch, pulling a threadbare blanket over himself like a man trying to shield himself from more than just the cold. I turned off the overhead light, leaving only the soft glow of the kitchen lamp to paint the room in warm, forgiving hues, and sat down at the table again, pulling my textbooks back toward me. There would be no studying tonight. There would be no escaping into equations or theories or papers. Tonight was about bearing witness, about surviving, about starting something new. I sat there for a long time, watching the slow, uneven rise and fall of my siblings' chests as they slept, the twitching of my father's hands as nightmares chased him through broken memories, and I realized that I had crossed a threshold tonight, one that could never be uncrossed. I wasn't a victim anymore. I wasn't a lost girl waiting for someone to come save her. I was the architect of my own life now, the builder of my own home, the protector of my own small, flickering fire. And no matter what storms came next, no matter how hard the world tried to snuff me out, I knew one thing with a certainty so deep it felt carved into my very bones. I would not break. They said family is supposed to keep you warm, but sometimes warmth comes from the most unexpected places. Subscribe for more stories where silence speaks louder than revenge.